Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for the final session of this year's Crucial Conversation series on challenging AAPI hatred. I'd like to start by thanking our generous sponsors for this series. Our presenting sponsor, Texas Instruments and Texas Instruments Foundation. Thank you so much for your leadership in the community and helping make this series possible. We're very grateful. And our series sponsors, IMA Financial Services and IMA Foundation, Nissan Foundation, Bank of Texas, and Mavs Take Action. We're grateful for all of your support at the museum and for this important series. And we have some wonderful community partners for tonight's, for the Crucial Conversation series. I'd like to thank Against the Grain Productions, AJC Dallas, Dallas Dinner Table, Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas's Jewish Community Relations Council, League of Women Voters of Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Refugee Services of Texas, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Temple Shalom. Thank you all so much for your support and partnership. And as always, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our museum members, board members, and volunteers watching tonight. We couldn't put on programs like this without your support. If you're interested in becoming a museum member or volunteer, please visit our website, dhrm.org, to learn more. We'd love to get you involved. Before I introduce tonight's session, it is my pleasure to welcome Leah Templeton-Hull, Diversity and Inclusion Business Partner at Texas Instruments, to share a few remarks.
Thank you, Mary Pat. Hi, I'm Leah Templeton-Hull with Texas Instruments. I'm part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team at TI. And we're honored to be the presenting sponsor of the Dallas Holocaust Human Rights Museum's 2022 Crucial Conversation series on challenging AAPI hatred. While the series has provided a learning opportunity to help build understanding, I'm most excited about this fourth and final session because tonight the panelists will address concrete strategies to combat AAPI hatred and how we can take action and be upstanders. At TI, it's our ambition to be a good neighbor in our communities, and we are very proud to work alongside the museum and support the programming, educational events, and exhibitions that the museum shares with the North Texas community. Like the museum, TIers work to build a company we are proud of, one where every voice, perspective, and background is welcomed and respected. Tonight, we're honored to have TIer Vicki Tung on the panel. Vicki is a director of government relations in our Santa Clara, California office, and she embodies our company's values. She's a proud upstander in her own life with her work and her family. Vicki, thank you for joining us and for representing TI. We look forward to a great discussion. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Leah. I appreciate you being here tonight, and we are so grateful for TI's incredible support of the museum and this series. The goal of the Crucial Conversation series is to create a space to discuss pervasive, important issues in our country and beyond. We began this year's series by discussing the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. and the origins of discrimination against AAPI communities. As a Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, we know the importance of looking to the past to inform the future. We know that the alarming rise in anti-AAPI rhetoric and violence in the last few years did not emerge from a vacuum. As our third session, focusing on the present, showed, the patterns we see today have deep roots. Tonight, we will turn our focus to the future and aim to identify concrete steps that can be taken to confront and disrupt AAPI hatred and support AAPI communities. We'll leave time for questions at the end of tonight's discussion, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your question, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. And we're recording this session, so you can always come back to it if you need to step away at any point. Just go to the DHHRM YouTube channel. And now I'm so pleased to have such an esteemed panel with us tonight and to be able to introduce them to you all. I want to leave as much time as possible, so I'll just introduce them briefly. Stephanie Drinka is a Korean adoptee, writer, and activist. She co-founded the Dallas Asian American Historical Society, an organization committed to researching, preserving, and amplifying the legacy of Asian Americans in the Dallas area. In April 2019, she launched Visible Magazine, an online publication that actively privileges the work of those whose voices have been intentionally ignored or suppressed by traditional media outlets. Victoria Tung is the Director of Government and Public Affairs at Texas Instruments, where she develops public policy strategies and advances the company's brand and philanthropic initiatives. She was previously appointed by President Obama's administration as the Associate Director for Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs in the U.S. Department of Commerce, and she co-led the effort to reestablish the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And John C. Yang is the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAGC, where he leads the organization's efforts to fight for civil rights and empower Asian Americans to create a more just America for all. His previous leadership positions include President of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, member of the National Advisory Committee for Race, Ethnicity, and Other Populations with the U.S. Census Bureau, and member of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. And our moderator tonight is Tammy Nguyen Lee, an award-winning film and television producer, director, on-camera talent, and philanthropist. A first-generation Vietnamese American, she and her mom came to the United States as boat people refugees and ultimately settled in Garland, Texas. In 2007, she co-founded Against the Grain Productions, a nonprofit production company with her husband, George Lee. Tammy produced and directed the feature documentary Operation Baby Lift, The Lost Children of Vietnam. I'm so grateful to our esteemed panelists, and it's a pleasure to now turn the conversation over to them. Thank you all.
On behalf of my tribe at Against the Grain Productions, thank you to Mary Pat as well as Annie Black, Carolyn Fangman, and the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for creating these essential spaces and opportunities for our community to come together to have these really important, albeit hard conversations. I'm honored to moderate this esteemed panel of AAPI leaders and advocates who have been blazing trails for diversity and inclusion, for justice and equality, and room for our voices to be heard. And I look forward to hearing what each of you have to share this evening. So we'll kick it off for each of you to describe to our audience, before we even get into our conversation, could you briefly just talk about how your own identities shape your work? Stephanie, if you would go first.
Sure. Well, I can confidently say that my identity, both as a Korean American woman and a transracial adoptee, is why I do what I do today. If you've listened to the NBC podcast about my hometown, the predominantly white suburb of Southlake, Texas, it won't surprise you to know that I grew up feeling like an outsider, even within my own family, who, as much as they love me, couldn't relate because they're white. So for the majority of my life, I couldn't see myself reflected in the media, in my community, in school curriculum. So I couldn't place myself in history or the world. And when you feel like you don't belong or you're outnumbered, you start to believe that your voice doesn't count. And so my work now, both with the Dallas Asian American Historical Society and with Visible Magazine, is all about amplifying traditionally excluded stories and reminding people that they matter.
Thank you. Your story definitely resonates with me. Vicki, if you'll talk about your identity and how it reflects into your work as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. So I hold multiple identities like everybody else in this world. I am Chinese American. I grew up as a child of immigrants from Hong Kong and China, working class parents. I am a mother and of two beautiful young children. And I think all these different identities, what I've been able to look at through my work is that each of these identities hold power and hold less power. And I think that's really important for all of us to know and understand what that means. As a woman, we are very powerful, but I hold less power than men systemically. As an Asian American, I hold less power than a white man. But I am a heterosexual woman, so I hold more power in some ways systemically than those who are not. And so for me, in all my work, I've really understood the power of where my power is and how to use that power for good. And throughout my life, I've been able to do that work through my work as the executive director of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, through my work at TI, through my work with the Obama administration. And really, it's similar to Stephanie, it's really amplifying our voices. It's really providing the stories and the missing stories that exist, that does not exist, and making sure that they exist and that we have a voice at the table.
I'm especially as a mother very curious to hear about your perspective, very diverse perspective. And John, we don't want to leave you out, please, if you'll talk about how your identity reflects into your work.
Of course. And first, just thank you for moderating all of this. And thank you to TI for sponsoring and the Holocaust Museum for holding this important discussion. And I'm so looking forward to this because after listening to Stephanie and Vicky, in terms of talking about identity, there's so much that we all share with respect to power, as Vicky says, with respect to being an outsider, oftentimes, as Stephanie talks about. So as for me, how I identify, among other things, I am an immigrant. Not only that, I was at one point an undocumented immigrant that got my path through citizenship through the Immigration Reform Control Act of 1986. So I actually became a lawyer before I became a citizen of the United States. I identify as a Midwesterner, someone that grew up in Chicago at a time when there weren't that many Asian Americans, and to the point of feeling like an outsider. I'm also someone that has had the privilege of living in China as an adult. From 2008 to 2014, my wife and I worked in China. And it's interesting, it gives me an additional perspective about how, as in that context, I was perceived as American and therefore an outsider. Whereas here, I am perceived oftentimes as a Chinese and therefore an outsider. So it gives us a different perspective on what that means and what it means to be anti-foreigner.
I know my mother is watching and very impressed with you, as I am as well. And I know you'll have a lot to share from your perspective as from Washington, D.C. So we'll kick it off with you. So in the first 3 sessions of this series, we heard about the historical roots of AAPI discrimination in the US and how this impacted what we see today. And for years, AAPI discrimination was underreported and ignored, but the increase in hate incidents after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic shed light on the struggles our AAPI communities face. So, John, what can be done by federal and state governments to ensure that AAPI communities are protected from hate incidents?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. And oftentimes, especially in this day and age, people say, well, what can DC do, right? And being from DC, obviously, I'm a little bit protective of that space, but there are things that can be done and has been done. First is just the fact that this administration, and I will call out the prior administration, this administration has recognized the harm that has been caused to the Asian American community and has used its bully pulpit to talk about or talk against Asia bashing or talk against anti-Asian violence, and that they have made that part of their speeches, not just during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, not just after the Atlanta killings, but has done that consistently. But then you think about policies, right? And there are some things that government has done and has done. Last May, the government passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. And that was specifically, among other things, targeted to address this anti-Asian hate that we're saying. Now, to be clear, this Hate Crimes Act does not create a new hate crime, but it really opened the door to getting resources to all of our communities to document the hate, to document the violence, and to give resources to respond to what our communities were facing. So just having that federal resources really was important, and to not just the dollars involved, but the agencies that got involved. And then just this past May, what we saw was the passage of a bill that started the study for a national museum on Asian Pacific American history and culture. And I emphasize that American piece because, and we'll all talk about this later, is so much of what is misperceived about our community, and the prior panels talked about this as well, is that we are seen as foreigners, that no matter how long we all have lived in the United States or were born in the United States, that we somehow owe allegiances to different countries, right? And so this notion of having a history that documents our presence in the United States, our contributions in the United States, will be important to breaking through that barrier of discrimination, of xenophobia, that gives rise to the anti-Asian violence that we've seen. So those are some, just scratching the surface of some of the things that the federal government can do. So what we've seen from the national stage, that does have a ripple effect that is really quite consequential for all of us.
I absolutely agree with that. And you touched on the documentation portion, so I just want to return to that really quick. So we know increased documentation of hate incidents is quite key to building support for the AAPI communities. So how do you feel like the role of documentation will evolve over the coming years?
Yeah, it's critical, right? Because that was one of the things, and a group called Stop AAPI Hate, our group as well, really documented, and gave numbers. The fact that Stop AAPI Hate in the last 18, I think at this point, it would be about 18, 20 months, have documented over 11,000 incidents of anti-Asian hate. That gives you some sense. And we all know that's underreported, but that gets through the barrier of people saying, well, is this a real thing? Because outside of our communities, let's be real, people still say that. Where this will evolve, I think, is if you think about, platforms, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram or TikTok even, there are efforts, ADL is leading some of these efforts to sort of scrape that data and really be able to sort of give a different context to what we're seeing in terms of what types of hate is emanating out there. The other thing that I would caution about is, by doing that, we also will be in a position that we could document more accurately. One of the things that we have seen over this last year and a half that I want to be very clear in pointing out is that the violence occurring against the Asian American community is not principally coming from the African American community. That is a misperception that is out there. A lot of people see viral videos of most typically an African American male attacking an elderly Asian American female and say, this is a Black Asian issue, right? But although I'm not denying that those videos are real, they're not faked, that's not the reality. Studies that have been done by NIH at the beginning of last year, by the University of Michigan at the middle of last year, all show that about 75% of the attackers of Asian Americans are Caucasians, predominantly by huge numbers of Caucasian males. African Americans actually underrepresent those percentages attacking us. And so when we talk about documentation, we also need to be careful about using that documentation to get the truth out there and eliminating some of the misperceptions that is just furthering some of the divides that can happen if we're not careful.
That's disturbing, those numbers. So Vicki, I want to hear from your perspective, and John mentioned a lot of these opportunities, but what do you feel are your opportunities for documenting and responding to hate incidences, as well as preventing anti-AAPI discrimination from even microaggressions to violence?
Yeah, I mean, there's the importance of documentation is because, both John and I worked in Washington, D.C. for 11 years. And so a lot of times when we think about policy, we can't move policy forward without data. And our legislators are constantly asking for that number. But what I want us to go back is to look back as to why this is even happening. And people don't cause pain out of nowhere. People are inflicting pain because they're in pain. And so there is a bigger root that's there. And we saw during COVID that there were communities that were completely devastated and that were not given resources. We saw the most underprivileged people, the ones who are most hurt during COVID, that couldn't work remotely like the rest of us could, that had to be where the frontline workers, that had to be the grocery workers, that had no daycare while we were all trying to keep our kids back home and keep them safe. So I would think that, for me, I think what's really important for us to think about is how do we support all communities so they're not in pain, so that this pain doesn't even start, that these violence doesn't even start. How do we make sure that we have comprehensive healthcare and preventative healthcare? How do we have comprehensive immigration reform? how do we we ensure that we have opportunities for everyone to have good schooling? I mean, this is a much bigger issue that we can dive into as to what that would look like. But that's kind of my 2 cents as to what we need to be doing, and in addition to the documentation of the hate crimes.
It's definitely a bigger issue when we as a community were potentially scapegoated and used in combination with a model minority and scapegoated by the previous administration. It wasn't a good combination. So from your own experience at TI, how can corporations create safe and welcoming workplaces that educate their employees about bias and discrimination? It's a very big one.
I think there's multiple things that needs to be done. What we've seen over the last couple of years since the murder of George Floyd was there was a real groundswell of employees demanding for more. And I credit a lot of our employees from all over the country and all over the world for speaking up. I think that our younger generations are not tolerating the status quo anymore. In fact, they want the status quo to look different. And so our leaders are expected to look at this differently. And what I've seen is that, and I think there's a lot more that we need to do, but our employees are our greatest assets. They're the ones who are making our companies profitable, that are creating the technology that's driving these businesses. And so our leaders are looking at us and saying, we need to take care of our employees. And what does that mean? So from the top up, it's really important for our leadership to really intentionally internalize what this means as racial justice, what does diversity and inclusion mean, and to really embody what that means. And so we've seen our leaders speak up. Our CEO, Rich Templeton, put out a statement after George Floyd. We're seeing that our employee resource groups are actually speaking up and holding a number of different conversations about crucial conversations. But it's not just about training, because training only does so much. And it really is about keeping the conversation going. And it's not just for a short period of time, like Tammy, right before this conversation, we're like, oh, I can't believe we have to still have this conversation. We need to continually have this conversation. How do we make sure that every leader in our company and all our companies are having these conversations and not being scared about it? There are constant things going on, from Supreme Court cases, there are decisions being made, to anti-Asian hate, to shootings and whatnot. And I think that what's happening is that we're so afraid sometimes that it's a political issue. And what we have to understand is this is not a political issue anymore. These issues are coming, it's a human issue. And I would ask that our companies start thinking about everything that's affecting humans as a human issue, and how do we think about this as affecting our employees and supporting our employees so that we have a just world and more liberated world.
I want to drill down into that just a tad, because not every Asian American gets to work at a larger corporation, but maybe a smaller one. Maybe they don't feel like they have an ERG to support them. How would you advise for them to be able to speak up, not only without fear, but with some impact towards an employer?
I've been in smaller organizations as well as larger organizations. And I've also seen that my large organization that I work at not have ERGs that represent who they are. And sometimes it's really daunting to go, how do I start this? But it only takes one person. And we're going to talk about allyship later, but it doesn't have to be a person that looks like you. It could be a person that could look very differently from you, but sharing your story, which I also know that we're going to touch upon later, sharing your story, building relationships with the people around you, and finding common understanding. A lot of times, even in my own company, we start up having conversation, people get a little scared, like something happened, whether it's like a shooting or like the January 6th incident. We got together and we started having conversations and hearing each other and listening to each other and really listening to one another. And then starting to understand, like, okay, we're starting to listen to one another, but what can we do and what can we push for? And being constructive about it. I don't think that it's coming up and being loud and demanding things, but really being constructive as to what does this mean and what do we want and why is this important and how would this benefit the corporation or the organization as a whole?
I definitely agree. I think in the previous panel that I was on for the museum, one of the things that we found was so essential across the board, across the age, was how you can relate to people on a very human level, not from a completely policy level, but from mom to mom or friend to friend. This happened to me. How can you relate on the most human level is the most, sometimes most effective.
Yeah, and it goes
So-
also, if I could pick up on what Vicky said, to something else that she said right at the beginning, which is all of us have power in different ways. And so it's not just simply as an employee, even if you're at a small corporation, you should feel powerless. I mean, you do have certain power. And part of it is finding an ally. It doesn't have to be the CEO, but just someone that because you've had that coffee conversation when we used to have coffee conversations before this virtual world, would share some of those concerns. Start the conversation there, build a small cohort of people that are like-minded. Then you could build it out a little bit larger to the next level, if you will. It's those one-on-one conversations that lead to the 4 or 5 groups, study groups, small groups that will lead to the changes. I mean, at many corporations, that's how it's happened, right? It is small groups are saying we want change. Who's with us? And they found that there's a lot more people that were with them that maybe they even ever imagined.
And Tammy, I want to put a plug in. There's the Asian Leadership Alliance, which is an organization of a number of employee resource groups. And they've been a great resource for a number of companies to come together and for even individuals who are interested in starting one to see like best practices have been done across different companies and organizations.
Thank you for talking about that. I hope we can maybe post a link to that for those that are tuning in that may want a little bit more empowerment further on. I'm going to jump over to Stephanie because I want to hear from you. What do you feel schools are doing right now in educating students about AAPI histories and topics like racism and bias? And what do you feel needs more work? I have some young children who are in elementary and now middle school, and I'd love to know, what are they doing right and what really needs some help?
Yeah, I was really fortunate to study Asian American studies in college at DePaul University. Unfortunately, I had to wait until college to learn about my history. So I think, it's bigger than what individual schools or even districts are doing. I think one really clear example of progress being made is in Illinois. So the Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History Act, which takes effect this school year, 2022 to 2023, where they are requiring that in elementary and high schools across the state, that they address gaps in their curriculum and include a unit about Asian American history. We're also, even in Texas, the Texas State Board of Education right now is considering an elective for high school students about Asian American studies, and also the inclusion of different Asian American histories in traditional social studies curriculum from elementary on. So I think we have to look at some of these larger systemic policy opportunities, because it has to go beyond, one superintendent that believes in DEI or in Asian American studies and students. We have to codify it so that people are held accountable for our education. And it's very important, and it was mentioned several times, that our history is American history. And I think a lot of why we're here today is because our history was not learned even within our own communities. And there's so many instances in history that have taught us what we could be doing better, times that we could have learned and formed allyship with other communities of color, other marginalized communities, because we've all gone through really similar echoes of what we're experiencing now. And it's crucial that we include it at that younger level, at your kids' age.
I recently bought the book with Rise by Phil Yu. I mean, it was like a triad of amazing Asian pop culture leaders. And it's like, reads like a textbook for the last 50 years of what Asian Americans have been doing in all across the board. And I bought that specifically for my children and for myself, because like you, I didn't feel like I also received that education until going into college, into 2 formative years. I would love for our children to be able to learn that early on and develop that confidence. And I'm sure, Vicky, you feel the same for young children as well.
Tammy, you're on mute.
So John, we know that the internet can be hate-filled. So how do we combat this, and how can we use social media as a tool for good?
A wonderful question. I mean, and here I'm going to pull from a quote from Martin Luther King, which is, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And that is so true. I think there's a temptation on social media that when you see something that you object to, especially if it's written in a very flagrant manner, very extremist manner, that you want to react in kind. And I will admit, there are times that perhaps that's what it deserves. But the other thing I think that is important for us to remember is what is going to actually cause someone to change their opinions. How can we come together as a community, recognize our differences, and not cause those differences to be divisive? How can we converse and not confront? So those are all of the things that I think about when I think about the work that we do with respect to, the internet, how you use social media platforms. When you see misinformation, one of the things, tips that I would offer people is, don't always assume that the best way to combat misinformation is to get the truth right out there. And especially by tagging that misinformation, saying that's not true. Studies have shown that if you repost misinformation and try to disprove it, you actually further the misinformation. The better strategy is, well, there's two strategies. One is you have to figure out how awful it is. And sometimes it's better just to ignore it and let it die itself out. I mean, if you are going to combat it, then you need to combat it full force. And one post, one tweet, one Instagram is not going to do it. You have to make a concerted, repeated effort. The other thing, and I'm going to go back to my earlier example with respect to these viral videos of attacks on elderly Asian women by African-American males, is I would never repost that and post a link to the studies that I referenced. Rather, I'm just going to ignore that viral video. And then, in a modest amount of time, but close enough in time so that, that people that are thinking about the video will be interested in what I'm posting, post about these studies. Did you know that, that over 75% of the attackers of Asian Americans are Caucasians, right? So that I've put out and that's not a positive message, but I've put out the affirmative case without saying, look, there's bad data out there. So it's things like that, right? That in terms of how do we combat that hate, how do we combat that misinformation? Those are things to do. The other thing to do is, we joke about the cat, I guess it was the cat memes, right? What was the thing from a while back, and maybe I'm dating myself. But I think we forget about how endearing and how impactful positive stories are. I was at dinner with a rabbi last night, and he was talking about how for his 60th birthday, he and his family found 60 unsung heroes, and they posted about them. They talked about them through their media. I mean, one was a sanitation worker that went out of his way to find a wedding ring that was lost, tracked down the woman that had lost it, and actually gave it back to her, right? Those positive messages also, even if it has nothing to do with the subject that we're concerned about, help. And it helps build buy-in for the people that are posting it, so that when you are posting other things that are more fragile, more sensitive, you're going to start having some more buy-in. So those are some tips that I would offer about how we deal with the internet right now, but it's rapidly evolving, and we have to listen.
Those are wonderful tips. And I hope that, John, you'll be starting a stand-up soon to get us into all the things and all the facts that you have to share with us in a funny and engaging way.
Well, I'm happy to share facts. I've never been thought of as funny or engaging, so that's a piece I have to work on.
There's growth everywhere. Stephanie, I know that you know this. We know personal stories can be very important and impactful. What role can storytelling and the arts play in creating awareness and building bridges between communities?
Yeah, storytelling is so important to talk about when we're having this conversation about hate. Because when you think about hate crimes, and there's sort of a misnomer that hate is in the traditional sense, like we loathe this person did something really, to personally offend me. But hate, when we talk about Asian hate, is bias against people for something that they can't control, for their ethnicity, for their nationality, for their race. And it's a very dehumanizing thing. It is, at TRHT, we used to call it a false hierarchy of human value. And it's this idea that some people are less than just because of their race or their skin color, etc. So the way we heal from that and we rehumanize each other and we restore our relationships is through those things that make us human. And that is stories, that is the arts. It's all of the things that, we love about humanity and each other. And I think, as John said, the power of social media combined with those stories is a really good, we have this ability to counteract some of the negative narratives in the media. We have ways to informally educate young people outside of the classrooms. And I think the more people feel comfortable telling their personal stories and using their platforms to do that in sort of non-traditional ways, because we're used to using the internet for capitalist purposes and for promoting our businesses. But what if we did that and we used it to share our stories and to amplify other people's voices? If we're going to talk about allyship, but what does it look like to use your online influence and give that space to somebody who doesn't usually have that ability to share their story to that large of an audience?
From one artist to the next, I want to kind of continue with Stephanie for a second. Since the shootings in Atlanta, there was a lot of questions from those who wanted to be our allies. What kind of stories should we be reading? What kind of movies should we be watching? Do you have any recommendations for a list of any resources for those of us who are tuning in that would be helpful to watch?
Again, maybe my historical society site is coming out, but I think there's really good examples in history, in documentaries, in first-person narratives about the things that have happened. Even locally in Dallas, this year, we had a shooting in Koreatown at a hair salon, and it was really bringing up memories of the LA riots. And I had the opportunity to watch the documentary Saigu in college about the LA riots from the perspective of the Korean business owners. And learning more about that helps inform some of the things that are happening today. I don't, unfortunately, sometimes traditional pop culture sensationalizes things. And I think going back to some of those first person accounts and oral histories can be really powerful when you using that same example. As John pointed out, a lot of this pitting us against the Black community also happened during the LA riots. And while Koreatown was burning and Black and brown people were fighting, the policemen were protecting the white wealthy suburbs. So I think there's echoes of this that we have to pick out and learn from.
Thank you for sharing that.
And Tammy, I would say there's a lot of documentaries out there from we just celebrate, we just recognize the 40th anniversary of the killing of Vincent Chin, and there's a great documentary by Helen Zia. And there's documentaries about Grace Lee Boggs, a great civil rights advocate. But what I would say is, as a mother, what's been really amazing over the last few years, having young children who are Asian American, my children are Korean, Chinese, is that I've seen so many more movies showing people of color and specifically Asian American children in movies. And I think that's something that's really groundbreaking, something that I would say Stephanie, John, and Tammy, myself we didn't get to see that growing up. And seeing my Black, white, Latino friends being able to see Asian Americans and also with their own children, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And representation in media, representation in storytelling of all our cultures is so incredibly important. So not just the painful, not just the painful part, but the beautiful parts of our culture.
Absolutely. And since Vicki, you're already speaking, I want to ask you about allyship. What does allyship look like, and what steps can individuals take to work against racism and discrimination from even our young to the elderly?
So I often get asked, like, what can I do? And when something happens, it feels really daunting. And I remember when I was in college, what I saw was that people were, everyone's young and passionate, and we would go out and protest. And they said, friends would be like, oh, well, I'm not going to do that. That's really not my thing. A friend and former colleague of mine, Deepa Iyer, created the social change system map. And it shows that we all play different roles. We can be healers, we can be disruptors, we could be frontline responders. So, I think we had to look internally as to what we want to do and what we're comfortable with. And the most simplest thing is sometimes it's just speaking up. Like, it's a very simple thing. It can be also very scary for someone. If you see something that's going on, speak up. Look at that person, protect them. I mean, there are simple things that we can do to show support, and we just have to identify what role we want to play. I've taken on multiple roles as an ally to friends and to colleagues and through my work in coalition building, and it has looked differently in different ways. And sometimes it's me as being a healer and working with them and talking to them and being a listener. Because the simple things of just listening to someone and hearing their stories and holding space for them is incredibly important. If I'm seeing something that doesn't look right, that seems wrong, I would speak up and say, hey, like, what's going on here? I've also taken a role of starting a rally. After George Floyd's murder, I created a parental and student march in San Mateo County, and we had 250 students and parents and teachers walk with us in our neighborhoods. So it could look differently, it's just depending on which roles you're comfortable in playing. And I'm sure John and Stephanie might have other input as well.
Yes, I would love for Stephanie and John to jump in, but for you, Vicki, I love that you pointed things out from someone who is just a layman, or simply put, feels like they are just a mom. What can I do? To someone all the way from a corporate level. There's so many different things in between, and all the different roles you play kind of play into the Enneagram of who are you?
Yeah, I think allyship, the first thing is listening with empathy, and allyship has to be reciprocated. And so when I think about allyship for the Asian community, I want to know what that looks like in terms of us being allies to other communities. And when you think about the results and the reaction to rising anti-Asian hate crimes, a lot of the calls from our community were for increased protection from police, which is something that other communities of color have been fighting against. And so what does it look like to listen to what they're asking for and be allies to them, instead of, advocating for our own safety at the expense of others? So I think it's really important that we advocate in a way that is empowering to everyone, and not necessarily asking for support for these systems that have harmed us as well. So, not cooperating with localities, not cooperating with ICE when they're trying to deport other communities of color or our own people. Those are important things.
One thing I would say is, in terms of allyship, is how do we, or sort of, if I'm going to be an ally, how do I take the burden a little bit off of someone that is more vulnerable? So, for example, if you're thinking about the relations with African Americans, Asian Americans, like, how do I, as an Asian American, help my African American friend? It could be as easy as if someone goes up to her and says, why do you insist on saying Black Lives Matter? Why can't you say all lives matter? It should be my responsibility to say, hey, let me explain this to you. It's because Black lives have never mattered. And so it's right to call that out. And that's why all lives matter is not sufficient. It shouldn't have to be her burden all the time to justify that. On the flip side, right, if someone asks me, well, what does it mean to be an ally for the Asian American community? One simple step, again, these are very micro steps, but useful sometimes, right, is if someone asks me, like, where are you from? Right? And all of us have gotten that question before. I typically answer Chicago, and then you get that, where are you really from, right? I would want one of my non-Asian friends to say, he's from Chicago. That's a Midwestern accent that you hear, and he loves the Cubs, whatever, right? It shouldn't have to be always my burden to explain who I am and what my identity is. So those are like the small examples, but then obviously you could cascade that out. Like if you think about education, Stephanie was talking about education, is also if someone expresses interest to our groups about having Asian American history, we should be the ones also say, don't forget about Pacific Islanders. Don't forget about the indigenous population. Obviously, don't forget about Jewish, African American, and Latino American. If they're focusing on Asian Americans, hey, that's great, but let's be inclusive.
I think it's a very big, tall order when we have such divisiveness within our own Asian community, within our own Asian communities, much less our communities of color. So that's probably another conversation we need to have about how we combat all of that together, right? So John, while we're with you, it seems the rise of hate incidences during the pandemic sparked a national movement of support for AAPI communities all the way up to the president, which you mentioned in the beginning. So how can we ensure that that support for AAPI communities continues?
Yeah, and this is where, number one, the fact that we're having this conversation at this point, what is it, 18 months after the murders in Atlanta, tells us that that momentum continues. And again, I applaud the Holocaust Museum for recognizing that, because obviously and I applaud the corporations for continuing to step up, because obviously in the aftermath of George Floyd, we saw this increase in interest in the African American community. The aftermath of Atlanta, we saw increase of interest in the Asian American community. I will say that I'm heartened by the fact that although understandably some of that interest has waned, it has not disappeared or has not gone to 2019 levels. And part of that is, part of it is all of us to have the burden. It's also a privilege of pushing to maintain that momentum. So whether it's employees as part of an ERG, whether it is for me as someone that is able to talk to policymakers to remind them of these issues, all of us can play a portion of that in keeping that momentum going. And then remembering that the news of the day will always affect us. For example, the fact that Nancy Pelosi is visiting Taiwan, although people don't think about it, that raises the level again of the geopolitical tension between the Chinese government and our government, which leads ultimately to that backlash against our community. So that is a time for us to remember, don't say the Chinese are our enemy. It's maybe appropriate to say that the PRC is not our friend. The Chinese government engages in horrible human rights abuses, is anti-democratic. That's a fair statement. But once you generalize to the Chinese or Asians, any generalization like that is where we end up with a backlash. So, how we keep up that momentum is reminding people consistently, and it doesn't have to be uber vocal, so to speak. It doesn't always have to be protests, but that all of these things build up and ends up in the spaces that we've seen, whether it's incarceration of Japanese Americans, whether it is backlash after 9/11, whether it is, as we've seen in the last couple of years during the pandemic, anti-Asian violence.
And these thoughts can happen even just internally. They're detrimental to us, even if you don't say them, but you think them. I know in my own family, we've had very difficult conversations, and we are a multi-Asian family, but there are tensions even between Asians, like I mentioned. So sometimes we have to dig down into what our own inner prejudices and racisms are, and how that emanates and has the cascading and ripple effect to the outer communities. We have to start from within. So I ask you, how do we engage people who think that there's just not a need for this kind of conversation?
If that question is directed at me, I'll start. But I think obviously Stephanie, Vicky, you guys have to jump in on this.
Please.
Part of this is that's where, as Vicky said, the data matters, right? Oftentimes statistics engage, but then the actual stories sell, and that's why both what Vicky and Stephanie said is absolutely critical. Is that you need to tell people, look, this is real. Here's the data, and then look, this is actually the human cost. Here's a specific example. So that's how you engage. But then also, I do believe that you have to meet people where they're at. Now, some people would would say that that's too compromising. We have to live by our values. I think if we are to engage in conversations, we have to recognize that all of us come with certain biases. And if we engage them where they are and help explain, right, and not necessarily in an argumentative fashion, help explain why it is that what they believe may have been misguided, right? I think that will help. And the other thing here is, and this is hard, it's where these one-on-one conversations are so critical, right? I mean, there are neighbors on my street that I know disagree with me on 90% of the issues, but because they're neighbors and we agree that we don't like it when that car speeds by our road, down our road, we can engage at a personal level. And then even if we agree to disagree on some other issues, there's that baseline so that we can hear each other out.
And hopefully we're not having these conversations on social media, because it's always really complicated. Stephanie, and for
sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's really important to analyze why people don't think there's a need for this conversation and to dismantle some of those false narratives about, the model minority myth, for example. And I think, sharing the data is really important, disaggregating the data, educating people about, the different socioeconomic and experiences of different ethnicities and nationalities is really important. And I think the other thing too is reminding people that it's more than interpersonal racism. So a lot of people stop at the point where they say, I'm not racist, or the colorblind, I don't see color. So you have to widen their lens and talk about the systemic issues and how it impacts the larger systems.
Thank you, Stephanie. How about for you, Vicki?
I do think it just takes one person to really speak up. For Stephanie, I echo your thoughts about kind of talking about the bigger system that's in place. And, what I've seen in the places that I've worked is that, and John knows this as well, like we've been kind of banging the doors and the tables for like so many years, especially in the halls of Congress when I worked in Congress, and constantly sharing the same story, constantly talking about debunking the model minority myth. And it's constantly speaking up. And at every new place that I go to, I feel like I have to do it over and over and over again. And it feels sometimes hopeless. But then something happens and I become hopeful. So an example is with my own company at Texas Instruments, after the murders of the women in Atlanta, I was completely heartbroken and like torn apart. And I saw my daughter, who at the time was 6.5 years old, come to me and was worried about my safety, my mother's safety, her grandmother's safety. And, I was like, we need to do something about this. And, I work for a company that values diversity and inclusion. And I wrote this ridiculously long email to one of our senior vice presidents. And she was so welcoming with my thoughts and opinions about what we need to do. We ended up putting out a statement, but what was really important is that there's still much more work that we need to do. And I'm not saying that we've done it all well, but it just takes one person. I would say that even having done this work for so long and having ran a caucus on Capitol Hill, that it was still very scary for me to do this. And I'm not saying it, so I want people to know that it's not easy, but it really just takes one person to start the conversation. And we shouldn't wait for somebody else to start the conversation. We need to do it ourselves. And if we don't feel comfortable doing it ourselves by ourselves, then we need to find allies to come with us and bring them along on that journey to start that conversation. Because great things can come when a small group of people start doing things together to make change.
That's such a great ending point. I want to thank Stephanie, Vicky, and John for sharing your amazing insights on this very complex issue that we know doesn't end just when our conversation ends this evening, but I hope it'll spark a lot of ideas for thought and for change moving forward. And with that said, I want to welcome some questions for our virtual audience. I'm going to go ahead and give those to you. The first question is, there's a growing backlog of Asians waiting to immigrate to the US, and many of whom are skilled workers or looking to join their families. Where does immigration policy fit into this conversation, and what changes need to happen? Who would like to take that question?
I guess I'll start because it's a
Okay, John.
policy related question, if you guys don't mind. Yeah, and this is actually, the immigration policy is in some ways the front line to some of these issues that we're talking about. And it's a symptom of the problem that we have. And what I mean by it's a symptom is, all of the rhetoric against immigration policies emanate from this xenophobia, from this anti-immigrant, this notion that somehow by having more immigrants, America becomes weaker. And so we have to frame the immigration issues correctly and recognize that all of this makes America stronger. And that's why, as a practical, if you want to get into statistics, based on the reproductive rates in the United States, America will not be able to sustain itself without immigrants. So if we just want to talk about national productivity, and who am I as a civil rights activist to talk about economics, but that's the reality to it. Framing it in a different way also is to think about this, right, in terms of making sure that we're growing the pie, right? So like part of this question is about skilled immigrants, and I want to push back a little bit on that question, because I think we need to also question what the definition of skilled is. For us, part of this is about making sure that family members are able to reunite with their family members here, regardless of what degrees they have, how much money they have. The fact that I could bring my mother here to the United States so that she could help care for my kids, although maybe she doesn't even have a college degree, that's still a skill, right? So we need to broaden this definition. Sometimes we get into this false notion that we want, a merit-based immigration policy. Well, frankly, when people talk about merit-based, they're talking about something that is, I would call it class-based. It's based on people that have money, based on people that have political connections. Let's broaden, because if you think about the immigrants that have made it here in the United States, Levi Strauss, who was an immigrant, literally, I'm going to use this pun intentionally, not a penny in his jeans when he came here, right? And talk about something that is an all-American product. Google is an all-American product, and that was founded by immigrants. So let's broaden that definition of all of this, and then think about what that means to the national narrative about what it means to be American.
Yeah, thanks, John. And John has worked on this for a long time. I spent 11 years working on immigration policy, and we had a great piece of legislation in Congress, which is a comprehensive immigration reform bill that was unfortunately broken to pieces after the last administration. And it's very devastating because it was a very comprehensive bill. It was not perfect by any means, but it did cover all the different aspects of immigration policy, which is what is needed and could change the story of like where we're going. And I think there's this mentality of scarcity that we have in this country, which is so unfortunate. Like if someone comes here, they're going to take my job, and that's not how it is. I want our community to reimagine the possibilities of what jobs could look like and how we can have opportunities for everyone. And just to kind of piggyback on what we talked about in terms of storytelling, so much of our work around trying to push the CIR bill for was storytelling, was bringing people who are immigrants, various backgrounds from like business leaders to those who are like coming here, trying to come here to rejoin their family, to share their stories and humanize the immigration story. And so my hope is that we can go back to that place where we'll have really good immigration policy moving forward, because I think that will make incredible changes.
Thank you for adding to that. We have a question for Stephanie. Stephanie, can you speak a bit more to the importance of preserving and sharing Asian American history And what inspired you to start your organization?
Sure. Well, the importance of preserving Asian American history is because a lot of it has been lost over the decades, over the century. And the importance of it is our history is missing, and American history is incomplete without our stories. For every issue that America has experienced, for example, with immigration, even locally in Texas, if you learned the history of Asian American immigration and Texas history, you would know that border control and immigration as we know it was formed to keep Chinese immigrants from immigrating across the border from Mexico. Chinese immigrants actually used to disguise themselves as Mexican to try to come into the United States. That's something that I didn't learn in Texas history, and it's really critical information if you want to understand our border control and border patrol systems now. And I think what inspired me, it was grief. It was seeing history repeat itself. It was seeing people blaming the loss of jobs because of COVID on Chinese, and hearing the words of Vincent Chin's killers who said, "It's because of you mother effers that we're out of work" in the 1980s. And knowing that if people knew about Vincent Chin, when they heard those things being told, and quoted and being said by political leaders, they would have put a stop to it, because they know that the end is, our lives being taken. And so I was inspired to start it because I want to stop repeating the things in our past that we should have learned from, but we didn't because our stories were not told.
Thank you, Stephanie. The next question from our audience, for all of you, do you see any generational differences within or outside of our AAPI communities in the ways that people have responded to recent hate incidences? And if so, what do you think that means for future advocacy and activism? And feel free, John, if you want to start this one too, maybe at the top.
Yeah, and actually, Stephanie sort of started the answer, so I'm going to tease it out and then ask her perhaps to go more, because one of the things we've seen is with respect to law enforcement and how, it is in some ways for older Asian Americans have been sort of, when they talk about public safety, they talk about it in terms of law enforcement. For our younger Asian Americans, public safety means something different, a different vision. And so there are some differences that we've seen, but I'm going to just leave it there and then ask Stephanie and Vicky to fill in some of those, color those lines in a little bit.
Yeah, I would say we've started doing a lot of oral history interviews, and we started at both ends of the generational spectrum. We wanted to capture the stories of our elders before we lose them, and we wanted to, encourage young people to become engaged in history and preserving it. And so one thing that I've noticed is older generations had a lot of different things that they were facing. A lot of them were first generation immigrants. They were coming with very little money. And so their lives were about survival and, creating a better opportunity for the next generations. And some of the young people that we're interviewing, and myself included, didn't have those kinds of struggles. And so we have different sort of immediate needs in our lens. And I think for the older generation, survival and earning a living was very much, top of mind, that they didn't have time to think about social justice in the ways that young people do. They also didn't have access to resources on the internet and, stories at the level that we are. So I think there's a little bit of an empathy gap in terms of just who they've had the chance to encounter and build relationships in their lives.
Have you also realized the idea of rocking the boat for the older generation probably wasn't something that they were accustomed to? If anything, they kind of tried to leave that behind because they were trying to just
it's the American dream. This sort of idea that proximity to whiteness will keep them safe, and that's something that I don't see as much with the younger generation.
How about for you, Vicky?
Yeah, it's been interesting because, I've been having a lot of conversations with like my parents, and, things have shifted through conversations. And I'm so happy, Stephanie, that you're collecting those oral histories, because it is so true. There is a lot about survival and fear, and that keeps us separated from one another. I think that's a main thing that we have to understand. Like there's this fear and this, what does survival look like? And I think those conversations of I was with younger people do help, and kind of able to listen to one another is really important. You know, there's this one quote that I really love that I kind of go back to, is this Aboriginal quote, is, if you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And it's really like, when I talk to my elders, it's like, we're all connected with one another. And if we think about that, we're all connected in this world, like, what does that mean? And what does that look like? And what does that look like moving forward in terms of policies to support one another? And it causes my elders to pause a bit, because I think in some ways they didn't feel that there were people looking out for them, right, when they came to this country. But now when we're thinking about, okay, we're thinking about the next generation. So yes, like, you didn't have the support, but what does that mean moving forward so that we can have a greater country that supports one another and like think broader and bigger?
I think what you just said is such a great point, because I've had a lot of those difficult conversations around our own dinner table, which is multi-generational. I think the same, my parents also felt like they were not supposed to speak up, but when they see my generation, they can get a little bit leery, like, you guys are very fired up, and that's good, we think. But then when they see their grandchildren's generation, they feel a different sense of obligation, responsibility to move the pendulum forward, to move things forward in a really active and positive way, where for themselves, perhaps they didn't feel comfortable and safe enough. And for our generation as their children as well. So the next question, this is a hard one. Do you all think religious institutions and their leaders have a role to play in supporting AAPI communities?
100% they do, because I think religious institutions have a large role in a lot of our stories and our diaspora. And I think, you know, missionary work in Asian countries, Korea, for example, the fact that I was adopted into a white family is largely because of white evangelical Christian work. And so, you know, a lot of their teachings inspired our trajectories. And so they do have a responsibility in helping our communities now.
Vicki or John, do you have something to add?
Yeah, and it's complicated too, right? Because I think what I would ask of religious institutions and leaders is really to listen. And it goes back to being an ally, because I think there are times that if we're going to be honest and have these courageous conversations, religious institutions have fostered some of the discrimination and hate against our community, imposed their will, if you think about colonial times, and their religions on our communities. And so there is going to be a disconnect. Now, and part of the repair also is, you know, we see what certain versions of religions are trying to do. And I don't even know if I would say them religions or in the name of religion, trying to do to our society. And then I would ask religious leaders to, you know, check that behavior and to call out, that is not in the name of religion. It is not in the name of religion to believe in this sort of white Christianity where sort of that evokes the very memories of the Ku Klux Klan and racial supremacy. It is on religious leaders in some ways. I am going to put the burden on them and say to them, they need to say, no, this is not our religion. Our religion stands for love. Our religion stands for inclusion, and inclusion means all inclusion, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it obviously includes, you know, women's rights, etc. Right? So I think sort of there's a huge role to be played in all of this, but also be mindful of the history and the legacies that serve both as opportunities, but frankly as baggage.
Vicki, did you want to step in and add anything, any comments on this part?
Tammy, I mean, John took the words out of my mouth. There is, you know, in my work in Washington, D.C., I did a lot of work with religious institutions, and they were great allies to a number of the work that we wanted to push forward. Like they were great allies in comprehensive immigration reform, and a lot of work, after 9/11 with the anti-Muslim backlash. But like John said, there is, what we haven't talked deeply about is there's a bigger system in place of white supremacy, of colonization, of imperialism. The church has caused a lot of pain in this country, and there's a lot of healing to be done. And so I'm hoping that there is work being done to heal from what has been done, to recognize the history of these institutions and to right the wrongs. But these institutions have also provided great resources to many communities. So it is a tricky balance, but there is a great role for these institutions to support all communities of color.
Great talking point. So this is the final question for the evening. So kids have been discussed a few times tonight. Outside of what they learn at school, like what Stephanie said, how should we talk with our younger or older kids about this topic, especially when they see hate in the news or among their peers, for instance? And what's a productive way to do that while still being age appropriate?
I can chime in, and then John, I think you have young kids. You have kids too, so you can probably chime in too. Over the course of the last couple of years is when I started having these conversations with my children. I mean, they're age 5 and 8 right now, and so I opened up the conversation with just listening. My kids constantly remind me that I have to be a better listener, and they're incredible teachers to me. Opening the conversation up as to what are you feeling, what are you hearing, and getting a sense of what's going through their minds. Because even if we're not having that conversation with them, they're talking to their peers. They're connected to social media. My kids are not connected to social media, but their friends might be. And so it's really having that conversation and listening to them, I would say, is number one. Number two, it's really just starting for them to understand like what's not right. Why is this wrong? I tell them that I don't use the word good people or bad people. There are people who do bad things, because I don't want them to see somebody and then have a generalization that, like what we talked about, like this Black person hurt an Asian woman. That's not why I want them to understand and see that there are people that are hurt, that have done bad things to our community, and we need to be aware of it, and we need to take care of one another. So it's been amazing. My kids they're having these conversations. Their brains are bubbling with questions. They're constantly curious, but they're trying to right what's wrong. And so I would say that's kind of the beginning of those conversations. We have tons of books. I would say fill your children's libraries with books BIPOC, from people of color. Like that is a beautiful, beautiful resource for them to read about people's histories, like people's cultures, and that has opened them up to understanding the world and what's around them. And it's great that there's school districts that are starting to have Asian American history, but I would say there are many. Including I live in California in the Bay Area, and it's still lacking. Governor Newsom signed a law in place that requires ethnic studies in high school. But even that, the curriculum is decided upon individual school districts. I have no idea, like at that point, like what is going to be taught in my child's high school, and I have to wait till they're in 9th grade for that to happen. So there's a lot about teaching our history to our children as well.
Thank you, John.
Sorry, I'm not a parent, but I do a lot of work with young people, especially around storytelling. And I think there's this sort of misnomer that the children are our future. They are actually our present. They are living in the current times that we are, and they are not only capable of sharing their voice, some of their stories are the most impactful because they are closest to the issues. And so I think, in addition to listening to them, it's teaching them how to amplify their voice and use it for good, how to connect the things that they're interested in, art, music, and put their stories and the things that they want to see in the world into that, and train them at a young age that their voice matters, and find ways to amplify it.
Yeah, I think that's all true. So my kids are 13 and 9. They're both girls. And I have the privilege of doing this for a living, so to speak, right? And so they get to read interviews or see interviews that I do. One time after I did an interview on Tucker Carlson, the first thing my daughter said was, "Why does he interrupt you so much?" You know, and it's just taking cues from them about what they're picking up in these interviews. Or, "Oh, he sounds so mean." It's like, okay, well, why do you think he sounds mean? Why? What is causing that? And kind of going from there. Vicky's absolutely spot on. Is they're talking to their friends about it. So my wife and I was very intentional about buying a minivan. Part of that is that we could be the carpool parents, and we could just be flies on the wall, listening to whatever conversation they have, and then we could ask them about it later. But just get a sense. The last thing I would say is, in terms of approaching these topics, is model behavior. So again, and I'm not trying to say that we're doing everything right. Obviously my wife and I believe a lot in this. So like, we have books around the house. We have a book called White Fragility. We have a book, Crying H. Pachinko, the standard fare for Asian Americans in some ways. And lo and behold, my older daughter, I see on her, her desk, White Fragility, Crying H. We never asked her to read those, but she's taking our cues. Last tidbit in terms of just meeting them where they're at and then sort of pushing them a little bit is, so we've been working on admissions cases in the magnet school level, because we believe in inclusive policies, and sort of certainly we believe in affirmative action. And this, in Northern Virginia, there was a revision that was made to make it more inclusive. And there was a certain group of loud Asian Americans, conservative Asian Americans, that were objecting to these changes. And my daughter comes home one day and says, one of her friends asked her to sign this petition protesting the new policy. And she said, "I didn't do it." And I said, "Well, why didn't you?" "Because it's wrong." And I asked my friend why she's signing it. And she was saying it's discriminatory towards Asian Americans. And my daughter said, and I tried to explain to her that it's not. I'm like, yes. And then I talked to her about, okay, sort of what other questions did she ask? What else do you want to know? Right. But it's those, finding those moments. And, my older one's a teenager, so you never know what you're going to get from day to day. And just, if that's not the mood they're in, that's okay. We don't have to push it. And then just come back to them when they show some interest, and tease it out a little bit, push. Once they start to close down, back off again, right? I mean, that's the parent in me talking more than anything else, but at least for us, it seems like it's working.
And I think what you said actually applies to a lot of people, not just teenagers. So those are great pearls of wisdom. And on that note, I want to thank you again, Stephanie, Vicki, and John, for sharing these pearls of wisdom and your expertise with us, and for everyone joining us here tonight for the final session of this year's Crucial Conversation series. Thank you so much, and good night.